He promised to grow old with her, but forgot to tell her he wouldn't stay. Autumn in Florence, where it all began. They met when Florence was draped in burnt orange leaves and soft amber light. Isabelle, a French art historian on sabbatical, had come to study the fading frescoes of forgotten chapels. She wasn't looking for anything, especially not love. But fate, as always, had other plans. Elias was a German violinist playing under the archways near the Uffizi Gallery. He wasn't formally trained, but the way he played Bach could hush a whole street. He lived off coins dropped into his open violin case, his life stitched together by melody and spontaneity. One afternoon, drawn by his music, Isabelle sat nearby with a sketchpad and stayed longer than she meant to. He noticed. Their first conversation was awkward. Her Italian was better than his English, and his French was nearly non-existent. But somehow, they understood each other. Over the following weeks, they shared espresso on cobbled side streets, debated art and poetry by the Arno River, and wandered through silent museums long after tourists left. Elias made her laugh in ways she hadn't since childhood. She told him things she'd never said aloud, about her fear of permanence, her love for old things, her grief. Florence wrapped them in a slow, golden romance. What began as chance glances became long nights on balconies, candlelit dinners with borrowed guitars, and dreams whispered under thin blankets. Isabelle, who had always chosen logic over impulse, found herself falling without a map. By the time the last leaf dropped from the trees, she was no longer staying at her rental apartment. She had quietly moved in with Elias, into a one-room attic filled with music sheets, second-hand books, and the warm scent of cinnamon tea. She didn't know how long it would last, but at that moment, it felt infinite. A love without maps, Berlin, then Prague, then Vienna. After Florence, the world opened like an unfinished novel. Isabelle gave up the lectures and museums, packed her notebooks and scarves into a single suitcase, and followed Elias wherever his music called him. There was no plan. No calendar. Just the rhythm of train tracks, the hum of old cities, and the quiet certainty that they were together. Berlin came first, cold, gray, electric. Elias played at underground stations, his violin echoing through tunnels where strangers stopped, listened, then vanished like ghosts. They lived in a rented room above a Turkish bakery, wrapped in shared coats, eating soup from chipped bowls, and kissing under flickering hallway lights. Then Prague, poetic, misty, and strange. Isabelle took photos of crooked alleys and translated poems into her journal while Elias played by the Charles Bridge. They made just enough to survive. At night, they climbed to the castle hill, watching the city lights blur like candle flames. It was a poor life, but it felt full. In Vienna, everything changed. Elias was offered a place with a small ensemble. It paid well. It was structure. It was stage lights instead of street corners. For the first time, he had something to lose. And Isabelle? She began to feel like a beautiful bookmark in someone else's story. In Vienna, he practiced more and spoke less. The long walks grew shorter. The laughter softened. She stayed up alone, writing in the kitchen, wondering if love can survive without movement, if a love born on the road could live in one place. They were still together. But something had shifted. Their story, once written in motion, now stood still, and Isabelle began to fear that without the journey, they might lose the very thing that made them real. The shift, letters left unread in Paris. Paris was supposed to be their homecoming, a brief return to Isabelle's roots, a pause after months of motion. The city of light welcomed them with familiar scents and soft rain, but something between them was dimming. It wasn't a fight. It wasn't sudden. It was slower than silence. Elias took longer walks alone. He said he needed time to compose, to breathe, to think. Isabelle understood, or told herself she did. She spent hours in cafes with half-filled notebooks and cold coffee, writing letters she never sent. Some were to him. Some were to the version of herself she was slowly forgetting. They rented a small flat in Montmartre, close enough to her childhood street that it felt both comforting and haunted. Isabelle's mother visited once, commented on how thin Elias looked, how quiet he had become. Isabel just smiled, tired, tight, and said they were happy. It wasn't a lie, not exactly. Just no longer the whole truth. Then came the unanswered notes. At first, it was small, texts left on read, missed calls, mumbled excuses. Elias became a shadow at the piano, closed off in melodies she could no longer follow. Isabel started writing him letters, real, handwritten ones, something she hadn't done since Florence. She'd leave them on his desk, poems, memories, thoughts too fragile to speak aloud. He never mentioned them. Never replied. One day, she found them still untouched, tucked neatly beneath his violin case. As if he'd seen them, and chosen not to see her. That night, she stood by the Seine, watching reflections of streetlights dance like they were trying to stay afloat. She realized love doesn't always end with shouting. Sometimes, it ends with someone quietly not choosing you anymore. And in that realization, something inside her folded, not broken, but no longer whole. The years that followed, a life without his shadow. Elias left Paris before winter arrived. No farewell, no apology, just a short note left on the kitchen table, next to the empty coffee cup she always filled for him. Isabel read it once. She never read it again. In the years that followed, she learned how silence could become a kind of freedom. At first, it was survival, one morning at a time. She took a job at a small publishing house in Lyon, editing manuscripts by day, and reading poetry by night. The city was quieter than Paris, and she liked that. No street musicians. No train whistles. No echoes of him. She didn't stop writing. But her words changed. They weren't about love anymore, not the romantic kind. They were about stillness, healing, and the kind of loneliness that doesn't ask to be fixed. She stopped wondering if he would come back. The ache dulled. Her memories became softer, less like wounds, more like distant weather. Sometimes, someone would ask if she had ever been in love. She would smile and say yes, once, as if it were a foreign language she had forgotten how to speak. The letters she once wrote him? She kept them, tucked in a wooden box beneath her bed. Not because she hoped he'd read them someday, but because they reminded her she once dared to feel everything. Years passed. Hair a little shorter. Laugh a little lighter. She traveled again, to Spain, to the fjords of Norway, to bookstores in Ireland. But this time, there was no one waiting at the station. And that was okay. Isabel built a life that didn't depend on someone else's presence. A quiet, rich, and solitary kind of joy. She was no longer the girl who followed love across continents. She was the woman who had survived its silence and learned to grow in its absence. And while his shadow no longer followed her, it also no longer haunted her. A final note, found in Florence, years later. It had been nearly a decade since Isabel last walked the streets of Florence, the city where everything began. She returned not for nostalgia, but for a quiet photography exhibit tucked away in a sunlit gallery near Piazza della Signoria. Life had moved on. So had she. Or so she believed. On her last afternoon there, while sipping coffee at a little cafe beneath the same balcony where Elias once played his violin, a familiar sound caught her ear. Not music, but the accent of the barista calling out a forgotten name, Miss Dupont? Startled, she looked up. The man held out a weathered envelope. This was left here years ago. It's yours, I think. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable. Elias. She hesitated. Her fingers trembled slightly as she opened it, the past unfolding not in pain, but in memory. The letter was dated 2 years after their parting in Paris. Isabel. If this ever reaches you, it means you came back. I don't know what I'm hoping for, maybe just that you'll know I did miss you. I missed the way you saw beauty in the ordinary. I missed your silence, the kind that never needed to be filled. I was a coward. I chose noise over depth. Applause over presence. And I lost the only quiet that ever felt like home. I don't expect forgiveness. I just hope you're happy now, even if that happiness has nothing to do with me. Somewhere, under this same sky, Elias. She folded the letter slowly, carefully, and tucked it into her coat pocket. But she didn't cry. Not this time. Instead, Isabel smiled, not for him, but for herself. Because the truth was, she was happy now. Not in the sweeping, cinematic way love stories once promised her, but in a quiet, steady way that came from surviving, growing, and choosing peace over longing. As the golden light of Florence spilled onto the cobblestones, she stood up, left a generous tip for the barista, and walked away, not with a broken heart, but with a full one. Because sometimes, the most beautiful closure is knowing you no longer need any.